Hello, it's Professor Harper again, and we're going to talk about ethics, not law. There's a common cliche in journalism, which is, and in life generally, that what's legal may not be ethical and what's ethical may not be legal. But I wanted to take you through some ethical situations and some foundation in terms of ethics so that you have an understanding of the basic overview of ethical situations, because a lot of time as journalists, we really don't have we haven't established a firm ethical foundation. I recall one time as a young reporter I was covering a big news story in Jonestown, Guyana, where a number of people had died. And I was one of the few journalists who actually got into the scene and saw the 900 dead bodies. And I was in the home of, or apartment complex of the Reverend Jim Jones, and there were a number of letters that were written to him. And they all started out, "Dear Dad." And I was working for Newsweek magazine at the time, and I was copying down some of these, and I decided, why don't I just take them? So I took them, stuffed them in my pocket, and had a worldwide exclusive. But then I realized that what I'd done was possibly illegal, although it wasn't a fixed crime scene at that point, but it certainly was unethical. And I got a $5,000 raise, had a big scoop, and everyone was happy. But I saw that I'd violated ethical principles because I really hadn't established what that foundation was. So I'd like to just take you through some standard ethical issues and philosophies, and then some situations. So for example, you've probably heard of these before, but the golden mean was created by Aristotle, and it was based on his ethical structure that there is moral virtue at the location of two extremes, not the middle between good and bad, but two good alternatives. And so it's the point between two positives, and it's called the golden mean. The golden rule you've heard about is a religious rule that you love your neighbor as yourself, and this ethical structure essentially affects decisions, including all kinds of things, and it basically prevents the exploitation of those with less power. Another one is the categorical imperative, put forward by Immanuel Kant, an 18th century German philosopher. And he basically argues that individuals should act on that maxim which you want to become universal law. It's an ethical decision that there but for the least of us go I. Oftentimes journalism is called Kant light, because we tend to go for the underdog and show that if this can happen to this person, it may happen to all of us. The principle of utility comes from John Stuart Mill, and this is more a majority rule situation, so that what it stresses from an ethical standpoint is how useful the results are for the widest number of people. There are two later ones, but one that's important is what is called the veil of ignorance, put forward by the late John Rawls. He died several years ago. And essentially what it says is that you have to take a step back and put aside all of your biases, be kind of like tabla blanca, and to make ethical decisions that are devised in a way to make yourself equal with all members of society, eliminating your age, race, social standing, and other qualities. Obviously very, very difficult to do. The other somewhat new ethical standpoint is what's called the Potter's Box, put forward by Ralph Potter of the Harvard Divinity School. And what he does is he kind of establishes to take in all ethical perspectives. And it's not situational ethics where you simply see a situation and you make a decision on the spot. But he takes you through a series of steps. Define the issues. Identify the values that are involved. Apply all of the ethical principles that we have seen. And then choose loyalties. So what he means by choosing loyalties is that is my loyalty to myself, is my loyalty to my family, is my loyalty to my business, is my loyalty to the nation, and those can really come into conflict. There's some obvious ethical violations, fabrication of information, plagiarism, a conflict of interest, illegal acts, and violating someone's privacy. And these are the types of things that can really get you into trouble when it comes to issues of defamation and libel. So whenever I go into a courtroom, I'm not specifically talking about the law. I come as an expert witness to determine whether the news organization followed standards and practices in the field of journalism, and also those standards that the news organization may in fact have created for itself. So I'll take a step back here just for a moment because I want to talk about the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, which is, there are a number of codes of ethics. There's the Radio, Television, and Digital News Association. There's the Association of News Editors of America. There's the AP Managing Editors. There's the Photographers Association. But the SPJ Code of Ethics is one that I immediately go to whenever I'm asked a question of law. And first and foremost, the SPJ Code says seek truth and report it. And the journalist should be honest, fair, and courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information. Journalists should test the accuracy. Seek out subjective news stories to give them the opportunity to respond to allegations of wrongdoing. Identify sources when feasible. The public is entitled to as much information as possible on sources of reliability. Always question sources' motives before promising anonymity. This is one thing which we will talk about later in confidential sources, where a lot of news organizations get into a lot of trouble when they promise the ability to keep a person's name private in a story. Some of these deal with fabrication. Make certain that headlines, news teases, don't oversimplify. Don't distort the content of news photos or videos. Avoid misleading reenactments or staged events. Avoid undercover or other surreptitious methods of gathering information, except when traditional open methods won't yield the information that you need to do. Tell the story of diversity and magnitude of the human experience boldly, even when it is unpopular to do so. Go to spj.org and take a look at this. One that's particularly important when it comes to, again, to libel and defamation is that ethical journalists treat sources, subjects, and colleagues as human beings deserving of respect. Journalists should show compassion for those who may be affected adversely by news coverage, use special sensitivity when dealing with children and inexperienced sources or subjects. I was involved in a law case where the reporter clearly violated the directive of a parent in interviewing a 16-year-old woman, and the news organization lost the case based almost entirely on that. Be sensitive when seeking or using interviews or photograph of those affected by tragedy or grief. However, that doesn't mean that you simply stay away from people who have suffered grief. News organizations report birth, marriage, death. It's all part of the human experience. Recognize that gathering and reporting information may cause harm or discomfort. And that's often what we do. But pursuit of the news is not a license for arrogance. You can't go out to get somebody. You can report what they do, but if you're found to be on a path where you are involved in a vendetta, you're going to get sued and you're going to lose. Show good taste. Be cautious about identifying juvenile subjects. Be judicious about naming criminal suspects before formal filing of charges. We've got a really interesting case right now, the Trayvon Martin case, where George Zimmerman was identified before he was actually charged. There was a case in 1996 where someone was named as a bomber during the Olympics in Atlanta. It turned out he didn't do it. He sued the news organizations and won several $1 million. Balance a criminal suspect's right of fair trial with the public's right to be informed. These are very important guidelines, and again, it's not a question of the law, but it does affect how lawsuits, particularly in defamation and libel cases, are carried out. Okay, you need to be accountable. Clarify and explain news coverage and invite dialogue with the public over journalistic content. Admit mistakes and correct them promptly. Now, as I said in the defamation lecture, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be sued for libel, but a correction or a retraction goes a long way towards mitigating the exposure that you have. Expose unethical practices of journalists in the news media. That's something we don't do a whole lot of because we're, I guess, kind of afraid of criticizing someone else because they may criticize us. And finally, abide by the same high standards to which journalists hold others. So if we want to hold public officials to a standard, we have to be held to that standard or hold ourselves to that standard as well. So that's just a brief explanation of ethics, which, again, it's not law, but it does impinge and involve law in many cases. And so before you go out there to report a story, you really need to get a sense of what your ethical structure is. And that's why I provided some of them for you. And that's not only true about journalism, but it's true in life, to have an ethical structure that you're going to live your life by. So thanks very much, and we'll see you online.